welcome back, and thank you to Ephraim Asili for joining us for this Q&A. So you said in the introduction, you were talking about the personal aspects of this film, and I know that there are autobiographical elements. So I was wondering if you could tease out some of those for us. I know that you were also part of a collective in your early 20s.
Sure, sure. Yeah, before I became interested in filmmaking, which I started to pursue in my mid-20s, I had dropped out of college after a year and moved back home to Philly and became really involved in a lot of the activist work that was happening in West Philadelphia at that time. And you know, it was a very intense window of time in my life, and it seemed very normal. There was a lot of that type of activism, collective houses and political prisoner support work or food not bombs or whatever was happening. It felt very commonplace at the time. Years later, you know, making short films and then thinking about making a feature film, I knew that I wanted to work in a long form, but I wasn't sure kind of what story I wanted to tell. And I found myself thinking a lot about that window of time in my life in relation to more contemporary politics. And I started to think to myself, like, what would it be like to kind of make a film where I'm able to explore more contemporary issues, but through the vehicle of this sort of collective that I used to be a part of. And so I started to kind of write a narrative loosely based on that situation. But it's actually in a lot of ways quite different. Like I never actually inherited a house, and the characters are very different than the people that I lived with in a lot of ways. But then in other ways, it's spot on. For instance, you know, we were a collective of people of the diaspora, African diaspora, from different class backgrounds, different countries sometimes. And so that element was really important, but the specificity of like identity and that sort of thing is totally fictionalized. The other part that was very real was the connection with MOVE. I became very close with the MOVE organization at that same window of time and kind of wanted to pay tribute and honor that experience because it was so generative then and still is now. And so I was very much thinking kind of how would my 23-year-old self operate in today's environment, living collectively almost?
Right. Yeah, so Effie, I'm just wondering if you could say a bit about how you found the form for this film, because you're working with so many different registers here. There's documentary, archival material, you have scenes that are scripted, you're working with actors, you know, and then you also have different kinds of performance throughout the film. And also how maybe that related to how you worked with form in your short films.
Yeah, great question. You know, when I was making the diaspora suite, especially in the beginning, I really was trying to resist the idea of kind of typecasting or pigeonholing what I do as a maker. I didn't want to be thought of as an ethnographic filmmaker or narrative or whatever sort of camps there are. I didn't want to kind of fall squarely into one. And so when I started the suite, it was kind of this juxtaposition of narrative and the documentary impulse. And I was interested in that. So I tried it again for the second film. And then after that, I kind of moved in a different direction. But with each film in that suite for myself, I was really trying to develop a different part of my practice, whether that be just getting comfortable shooting film itself or different approaches to editing, working with longer takes, shorter takes, synchronous sound, asynchronous sound. And I thought of the diaspora suite for myself as a sort of way of working out my visual language, the way I approach editing, the way I approach cinematography, but that I was very deliberately kind of working that out, trying things out and say, okay, this film works this sort of way, I'll bring this forward and I'll leave this behind. And at a certain point, I also knew that I wanted to stop making films in the suite. It happened probably around the fourth film. I had the sense that I only wanted to do one more. And the reason for that is that I think that it's easy to fall into a tendency in short film and experimental film especially where you kind of make a film every year and you send it around, and there's a rhythm to that that I think can be very comfortable, but at the same time, I think it can be restrictive in terms of expanding what one's practice can be. And so at a certain point, I pulled away and started to ask myself, well, what about the diaspora suite could work in a long form? And what have I not done in a while that is still appealing to me? And, you know, narrative was something that I mean, I think every filmmaker, whether they admit it or not, are, you know, is interested in making some sort of narrative film in a somewhat conventional sense of someone, you know, back and forth dialogue, what have you. However, the question is, you know, the dialogue and that sort of a thing. I just forced myself to kind of go through that anxiety and just sit down and write, because I very much felt that one of the things that my practice could use was a more, not to say literary form, but being able to work with language in a much more deliberate way, and also using the form of, say, a script to give structure in some sense. At the same time, I was very attached to everything that I'd learned in the diaspora suite. And so kind of going in, it was this question of, how do I bring everything from the diaspora suite with me, but at the same time deal with narrative in a way that makes sense? A third sort of secondary concern in kind of going from short to feature is, how do you get funding to make a feature? I mean, it's a very big question. And initially I found that most of the people that seemed like they could have helped really wanted a conventional sort of script. And so I tried to push it in that direction, and I just found it impossible formally to do what I wanted to say and work with the sort of 3-act structure. But by forcing it, I think it also made me think deeply about what I could keep from that structure. From there, you know, there's a bit of improvisation. There's all sorts of elements that go into it. The other thing that I'll say that is a big factor in the form is what I look at in terms of watching films. And I try very hard to not make distinctions between types of films or national, you know, cinema of different countries. And as far as I'm concerned, it's all available. I don't know that that kind of approach works in a short film, but I was certainly interested in the long form to say, well, you know, I can use found footage, I can, you know, have direct address, I can have a scripted sequence, I can improvise at points. And so those were concerns, you know. I just want to say a little bit about location, and that was probably the most difficult part of the transition, and that I wanted to shoot this film on location in Philly. I was unable to secure the resources to do that. However, I was offered a black box studio to, you know, build a set in, which I initially didn't want to do because I'm so attached to location. But accepting that challenge really made me think about the black box studio as a material location, not just some place where I make some sort of fictive reality, but as a location in and of itself, and trying to embed that into the work itself without it being too reflexive in a way that kind of takes you too far out. And so really taking the location of the studio, what does it mean for someone like myself making work that I make to operate in that space, and being okay with letting that bleed into the overall structure.
Right. Was the plan always to shoot on film, which I know is something that you've done with your shorts as well?
Absolutely. That was another one of the sort of things that you send a budget to whomever, and they first eye roll you get is when you have this thing where you're shooting it on film, and it's like, but that was a must for me. Something that I'll add in terms of my form and structure is that as a filmmaker, I am also a photographer, and that's the tool of the camera, the instrument of the camera is very much a part of the work for me and how that operates. But that's something that I'm doing myself, which is one less sort of filter that the work is going through. But I think that allows me to work in ways that feel more organic, because I can just kind of pull the camera out and shoot. And so for me, shooting on 16, kind of, it was a must. It cost me a lot in terms of being able to do multiple takes and all of that, but I just didn't think I could make what I wanted to make and not shoot it on film.
Yeah. for me, the materiality of the film kind of goes along with the the tactility of it in a way that's like it's so much a film about objects in a way, like totemic objects. You see the chest of books at the start, and then there's records and photos and posters. It's like such a wonderfully annotated film in a way. It's like, are these all objects that are, I assume they all have meaning to you, and are they all from your collection? And can you talk a little bit about the way the film sort of kind of traces its own, kind of canon of black radical cultural, politics?
Sure, absolutely. Sure, we're talking about Fluid Frontiers a little bit earlier, one of my films from the Diaspora Suite. And when I was shooting Fluid Frontiers, I had already conceived of the inheritance as an idea. In fact, I'd never worked with a synchronous sound camera or large format 16 millimeter camera. So in terms of the sort of trajectory of the work, it was like, I should try to do this in a short form before I think of expanding it. And in making Fluid Frontiers, I was trying to find a way to deal with my own attachment to the materiality of the books and the content in that film. So these radical ideas, it was all very important. But at a certain point, I realized that I can't really separate them from the material object for myself. It's not enough just to read these poems online, but I have this almost need to have the material there. And from that, I started to kind of think of the inheritance. Going back to working on a set, this idea of working on a set, suddenly I have what, for the first time in my sort of life as a filmmaker, feels like a truly blank canvas. The studio is just space, right? And so suddenly, where do the walls go? What colors are they? And then from there, you get into, well, what does the table look like? What's on the table? Which at first was terrifying. And then after I kind of got into it, I suddenly found it very empowering. It's like, well, I can place every single object in this space. And I spent about a year kind of going through my personal collection, but also looking around and sourcing more things. And so when you look at that set design in the film, everything in there was either something I already had or that I would pick up at a flea market or used bookstore, and very much built the set one piece at a time, from the ground up. And so everything was very much like kind of deliberately selected, or at least I have like a box of objects and we're doing a scene and I might make a small arrangement, but that's kind of how it went. And again, that is also embedded in the Diaspora Suite in some ways. Earlier on, I was more interested in kind of working in my relationship to, say, object art and painting into the films, but moved away for a variety of reasons. But this idea of the blank canvas having in the studio suddenly brought all those things, back into the picture. And so I tried to work with that in as deliberate a way as possible.
Right. I want to go back to what you were saying about this, this period of your life predating your turn to filmmaking in a way, but and you're active in politics, you're an activist, and I'm wondering if how you see the relationship between your activism, your politics, and your practice as a filmmaker. I know it's a big question, but
yeah, that's the question. I mean, I think that's the big one right there. It's a really difficult question in that I'm not sure. They're totally related, but they're by no means the same thing in my opinion. I would, no matter what type of film, how didactic, say, or informational it might be, I would never really consider making a film as a form of activism. However, I think it can be quite helpful in relation to activism. And so for me, activism is a person-to-person direct attempt at communication of a more specific idea. And so activism for me is something that revolves around very specific politics or a platform and a political agenda that needs to be executed. For better or for worse, I don't know that art is totally compatible with that type of thinking. It's hard for art to be totally didactic. It's hard for art to have a very specific agenda and at the same time leave space for the viewer to think. And so these are tensions that are always interesting to me in terms of how I'm making art. And I'm always making it making a piece, or particularly with the inheritance. It's almost like I want activists in some ways to be the audience for a work like this, as well as others. But at the same time, I would never say, well, this in and of itself is a work of activism because it has ideas that are radical or progressive. The activism would come before or after or simultaneous to that. And so, you know, if there's activism in relation to it, I feel like that will happen later, or it was happening, say, in some ways on set while we're working. But I don't really think of works of art as activist work. But I also I was fortunate enough to have done very concrete activist work prior to making film. And so I didn't feel like I approached film with a need to kind of use it in a way to, I'll say, compensate for something I wasn't doing politically.
You mentioned, you know, your influences and having very broad Catholic tastes when it comes to cinema. And it was interesting for us because we actually invited you to submit a list of films that you wanted to program, because you have selected a film for our revival section, Ivan Dixon's The Spook Who Sat by the Door. But you also sent us a longer list, and it was interesting to see, you know, I think you had Spike Lee, No Better Blues on it, and Godard. Maybe it was 2 or 3 things, and I can't remember what else. But like, it was interesting to see that those obviously are films that, you know, maybe are from very different worlds, but are also different ideas of like how cinema can be political, can have a politics.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, that for me, again, it's very important. I mean, I think the thing for me is that if I felt like certain direct approaches to activism for me in terms of filmmaking were genuinely effective, like that was the change that needed to happen, that's what I would do. But my experience of film watching and filmmaking is that the more sort of specific a work is, the shorter the shelf life of said work is. And what's important is that there are works that we kind of revisit. And so I think, you know, when I'm looking at a work like Mo Better Blues or 2 or 3 Things, and I think one of the films that I keep coming back to that I believe was on that list was Paul Schrader's Blue Collar. These films for me don't age because they're dealing with their politics in relation to the human condition in such beautiful and complex ways that the politics is just one aspect of it, but that's always the case. It's never just about the one politics. So, you know, in a film like Blue Collar, to explore, you know, the lives of these workers, with the factory kind of being the backdrop and a lot of the location, it heightens the intensity, I think, for me, and kind of allows me to kind of keep thinking about these other issues, like, you know, union organizing or class difference within factory workers in terms of, or racial disparities within the unions, these sorts of things. But if it's a very specific thing about that, I don't know that I watched that film 4 and 5 times. And so I try to kind of not necessarily copy any technique or anything like that, but I am fascinated with the films that I have to keep watching. And so when I'm making, I'm thinking always about, you know, trying to give reasons why a film should be revisited while I'm making it, if you know, you can do that. Or at least that's the goal.
Right. And I think, just to wrap up, I think another way to think about a political dimension of a film is also the context in which it is received, right? And I'm just, you know, wondering what you make of I mean, I saw this film earlier in the year, you know, and I think the current moment of reckoning over systemic racism and police brutality and you know, just the conversation around anti-racism is different now than it was 6 months ago. So, you know, I'm just wondering what you make of this context into which the film is emerging.
Yeah, it's really strange and hard to process actually a little bit at the moment. I haven't watched the whole film too recently, but the last time that I did, it was, you know, since things have been happening in the news, and I couldn't escape the feeling that it was made for now, like this moment. The problem being I'd made it a year ago and thought of it even years before that. But yeah, and so to me, there's a sort of like, yeah, in terms of the timing of the piece, it's a little bit uncanny, but at the same time, I think, you know, it's just that I'm responding to things that have always been happening, and that the sort of underlying politics of the piece and of, you know, the world we live in are having a moment in the public eye. However, you know, these issues were going on all along, and so it's awful that, you know, the film is timely for these reasons. At the same time, as an artist, I don't like to think that it's my job as an artist to respond to the world in terms of something happens and therefore I have to have a response. I think if it's not already sort of embedded in what you're doing and your approach, then maybe that is the problem. I shouldn't have to wait for someone to die in a very public way to be thinking deeply about human rights and what it means to be a human being and have respect, et cetera. And so these are underlying things that are always there. And then, you know, the sort of time we're living in is sort of just a very interesting sort of prism to look at it through. But, you know, I think it's just the ebb and flow of things. And it's a film that's just coming at a really interesting time.
Yeah. All right, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank you for this wonderful film and for taking the time to speak with us. So, Effie, thanks so much.
My pleasure, and thank you all for watching, and thank you, Dennis, Lincoln Center, for showing it. It really means the world to me, and it's truly an honor.